Tonight, America under siege. On this day of infamy, the world watches unspeakable acts of terrorism.
Something else has just happened at the World Trade Center. As you can see, one of the towers either has come down, perhaps something else has happened.
The death toll catastrophic. Tens of thousands of victims in New York's Twin Towers.
I hope I live. I hope I live. It's coming down on me.
A city of panic as war comes to the land of liberty.
And shock turns to anger. A nation rocked to its core, in mourning, but vowing to avenge a despicable evil.
We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbored them. America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world. And no one will keep that light from shining.
First at 5, 10 News with Walden and Jennifer Hansen.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this 10 News special. The world is still trying to comprehend the catastrophic terrorist attacks which struck without warning at the heart of America's financial and military might. The United States is ready to go to war with those who masterminded the hijacked suicide missions, which have claimed untold thousands of lives. Like Pearl Harbor, this new day of infamy has woken the anger of American people and sent shockwaves around the globe. Our 90-minute commercial-free news tonight includes disturbing images that will upset many people. However, the horror of these events cannot be hidden. John Hill begins our coverage.
There was no warning as the first hijacked aircraft, a Boeing 767, slammed into the World Trade Center just before 9 in the morning. It was a terrorist attack that struck at the heart of America. The 110-storey skyscraper engulfed in flames. As smoke billowed from the building, up to 50,000 people who worked there began evacuating as fire raged through the upper floors. On any scale, this was already a major disaster. But then, the unthinkable. Another hijacked passenger jet came screaming in, aimed directly at the second tower, the aircraft disappearing inside the building on impact and exploding.
No words, no reason.
And we saw the plane on the other side of the building, and there was smoke everywhere, and people are jumping out the windows.
Wreckage blasting out of the upper floors, sending tons of debris plunging to the street below. The fires raging out of control, panic on the street below as office workers began fleeing in terror from New York's financial district.
I don't know.
What's happening?
It's believed more than 20,000 people were still trapped inside, some appearing at windows, pleading to be rescued, others plunging to their deaths as flames forced them to jump.
Something else has just happened at the World Trade Center. As you can see, one of the towers either has come down, perhaps something else has happened. The billow of smoke that we have not seen. The tower is down completely, according to our producer. The side of the tower has come down onto the street.
The collapse caught on tape by an amateur cameraman.
I hope I live. I hope I live. It's coming down on me. Here it comes. I'm getting behind a car.
Lower Manhattan blanketed by an enormous cloud of dust and smoke, the entire drama played out live on television around the world. Crushed beneath the rubble, hundreds involved in the rescue effort. At least 300 firefighters are dead or missing, along with more than 70 police officers. The terror of the collapse witnessed by this man inside the remaining tower.
I was on the ground floor of the building, sitting in a chair, waiting for somebody to turn up, as you do. There was a huge bang. It felt to me like somebody dropped a skip full of rubbish, a great container full of rubbish from a very great height.
30 minutes after the first collapse, the second tower began to crumple as well, crashing from the top down.
And there's, you can see, perhaps the second tower, the front tower, the top portion of which is collapsing. Good Lord. There are no words. You can see large pieces of the building falling. You can see the smoke rising.
On the ground, more panic, shocked rescuers running for their lives. The collapse of these towers, once the world's tallest buildings, sending thousands of tons of rubble into the streets, trapping workers in nearby buildings, crushing cars, leaving the world shocked at the scale of the attack. As Americans struggle to comprehend the enormity of the disaster unfolding in New York, a third hijacked jetliner crashed into the Pentagon building in Washington, the headquarters of the US military, supposedly impenetrable, the impact sending the aircraft spearing through the building into the inner courtyard. More than 800 people at work inside the Pentagon are believed to have lost their lives. A woman aboard this plane managed to make 2 phone calls before the crash, telling of men armed with knives forcing all the passengers and one of the pilots to the rear. Aviation authorities closed US airspace, ordering an estimated 4,000 aircraft to land at the nearest airport. US warplanes were scrambled, streaking over New York and Washington. The terrorists behind these attacks had hijacked a 4th jet, a Boeing 757, which crashed near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. There's speculation its intended target was the presidential retreat at Camp David. All up, 2 United Airlines flights were hijacked, along with another 2 planes belonging to American Airlines. None of the 260 passengers and crew aboard the 4 airliners survived. Amid fears the attacks would continue, the US Secret Service threw a security cordon around President Bush.
Terrorism against our nation will not stand. And now, if you join me in a moment of silence.
He was hurried aboard Air Force One, lifting off for a secure destination as US forces around the world were placed on high alert. Back in New York, rescuers made their way into the impact zone, a virtual moonscape dusted with debris.
These are professionals. They're coming out of there looking literally stunned, in shock, many of them.
Hundreds of ambulances on standby. All hospitals in the greater New York area are now reported full, with thousands of people injured in the attack. Authorities unable to predict how high the eventual death toll will go.
The numbers are going to be very, very high. Just if you think of the number of people that were in the building at the time.
The terrorists striking not only at the US military, but also paralysing Wall Street, the world's busiest stock market. Returning to the White House, President Bush vowing the US won't rest until those behind the terror attacks are caught.
The search is underway for those who are behind these evil acts. I've directed the full resources of our intelligence and law enforcement communities to find those responsible and to bring them to justice. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them.
On any assessment, this attack on the United States was an outstanding success for the terrorists, a monumental failure for US intelligence agencies, which had no hint of the disaster about to befall them. But America remains unified in its determination to fight terrorism, members of Congress from both sides of politics coming together on the steps of the Capitol. John Hill, 10 News.
The acts of destruction in New York and the Pentagon have sent shockwaves across the world. Western leaders have spoken of their revulsion and outrage, uniting them in their battle against international terrorism.
It's hard to imagine anyone celebrating the wholesale loss of life, but throughout the Middle East, they're dancing in the streets. Men, women and children screaming with delight at the thought of thousands of Westerners killed or trapped under massive piles of rubble. On the West Bank, they're handing out lollies. The attack, they say, is a sweet from Arab terrorist leader Osama bin Laden. But as America mourns, it's appealed for a united front against its invisible enemies.
We call upon the entire world to step up and help, because terrorism is a common enemy to all, and we're in this together. The United States has borne the brunt, but who can be next?
It's a message already understood by America's closest allies.
This mass terrorism is the new evil in our world today. It is perpetrated by fanatics who are utterly indifferent to the sanctity of human life. And we, the democracies of this world, are going to have to come together to fight it together and eradicate this evil completely from our world.
Today's events in the United States went beyond national boundaries. It was a brazen challenge to humanity, to all the civilized people.
Like the rest of us, the world's leaders have watched the shocking events unfold on television.
There can be no doubt that these attacks are deliberate acts of terrorism, carefully planned and coordinated. And as such, I condemn them utterly. Terrorism must be fought resolutely wherever it appears.
Those people are merciless, they are killers, they are cheaters, they are liars. They don't have any limitation.
The leaders of the Western world agree terrorists have opened fire on democracy.
This is a declaration of war against the entire civilized world. I want to tell Americans they have the solidarity of the French people, especially to the families of the victims. What happened in the United States concerns all of us.
Even old enemies are making a joint stand against the cowardly killers of innocent Americans.
At this most difficult hour, all Israelis stand as one with the American people. Our hearts are with you, and we are ready to provide any assistance at any time.
Terrible act. We are completely shocked. Unbelievable.
Belgium holds the presidency of the European Union.
And for what's happened today in the United States, it's are acts of barbarism.
The US government's been inundated with messages of support from Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak to Chinese Premier Jiang Zemin. The superpowers are united in their anger. There's even been an offer of medical and humanitarian aid from America's foe of almost 50 years, Fidel Castro, who says Cuba expresses
its most sincere condolences to the North American people for the painful and unjustifiable losses of human lives caused by these attacks.
Very few countries are taunting America in its moment of pain. Iraq's Saddam Hussein says the American cowboy is reaping the fruits of his crimes against humanity. But like Pearl Harbor in 1941, it would take a foolish nation to awaken a sleeping giant.
There's only one way to begin to deal with people like this, and that is you have to kill some of them, even if they are not immediately directly involved in this thing.
Vengeance is expected to be swift, but with a long-term purpose.
America and our friends and allies join with all those who want peace and security in the world. And we stand together to win the war against terrorism.
Sean Fewings, 10 News.
We're now joined by 10 reporter Michelle Stone, who witnessed the horror unfold in New York. And Michelle, I understand there may be some new developments in the hunt for those who perpetrated these acts.
There certainly is. What I can tell you is that reports have come in from two separate planes that there were 3 to 5 men on these planes armed with knives. Most recently, a few minutes ago, we heard that on at least one of those jets that several flight attendants were stabbed quite badly, and that the passengers were pushed to the back of the plane, including the pilot. So clearly these attack teams were trained to fly in commercial jets. How do we know this? Because people on two separate planes were calling in on those telephones that you have on the planes. One woman calling her husband connecting with him seconds before her jet plunged into Tower 1. Her last words to him were, "What should I do?" Of course, she couldn't do anything. I will also tell you that the FBI has secured the passenger manifest, and that is giving them some leads that have taken them to the state of Florida, to the south of that state. They recognize names apparently on that manifest as belonging to men who were on so-called watch lists, men who were to be arrested immediately if they were attempting to enter the United States. Obviously men who were clear threats. I'll also tell you that behind me, the situation is, it's still burning, it's still very, very hot. Nearby buildings are still alight, and the rescue effort goes on. I can tell you that they have now pulled 3 people alive from that mountain of rubble that's down there. Incredible stories. People in nearby buildings are still trapped, but have survived. And people are calling from beneath that rubble on mobile phones. Now, whether the rescuers get to them in time is another matter.
Michelle, from a personal viewpoint, we mentioned earlier that you were there. In fact, you actually ran from the blast. Is that correct?
That's completely correct. Cameraman Paul Atkinson and I were heading downtown. We saw the first tower collapse. We were much closer when the second one went, close enough to feel it as the plume of smoke and debris rushed up the boulevard towards us. I was rooted to the spot. I could not move. I was paralyzed. But I suppose that instinct kicked in, and I immediately started looking for somewhere to hide. I thought perhaps I'll hide behind a van, and then I thought maybe the force of the oncoming debris would move that truck. So I kept running, and I found a garage that was open. There was a hysterical proprietor inside. He was on the telephone to his family, so I just rushed in there and hoped I'd be all right, and of course I was.
Lovely to hear that. We all know, of course, the toughness, the resoluteness of New Yorkers. How do you think a city like that and the people of New York will overcome this problem?
Let me tell you that the city is galvanized, and being America, of course, there are polls. Now, let me just give you this because it's pretty fresh. 87% of Americans are expecting another attack. I share that view. 86% of Americans support going to war, and it is expected that that will be the scenario that plays out. War is being a word that is being bandied about, and I don't think it's any exaggeration to use that word. Certainly a lot of past leaders and presidents are calling on the current government to respond swiftly and aggressively to what's happened. Security Council has met again in the early hours of this morning, and of course Congress is meeting tomorrow to vote on a resolution to support the president, and then technically that means that he will have the power to act as the chief executive to strike upon those they consider responsible for this. No numbers on casualties, and certainly nobody has taken responsibility for this act yet, but Osama bin Laden remains the prime suspect.
Thank you, Michelle. We'll leave you there for the time being. Reporter Michelle Stone reporting live from the heart of the tragedy in New York.
And the extent of the carnage is so high that authorities simply can't speculate on the death toll. It's a sleepless night for many New Yorkers, especially those who were on the streets in the horrific moments after the attack.
I was on the 36th floor of Building 1. All of a sudden, it was like an earthquake. Just shook. The building was shaking. Then I saw chunks of debris just falling down because I was close to the window. It was unbelievable.
What did we just see? I was just standing here watching the World Trade Center after the first plane hit. I just saw a second plane come in from the south and hit the south tower halfway between the bottom and the top of the tower. It's got to be a terrorist attack. I can't tell you anything more than that. I saw the plane hit the building. I can't say anything.
No, while we were standing out here, we saw, was looking up at the fire, and we saw people just coming through the window, falling out. It was terrible. It was terrible.
Still around, guys. Still around.
God bless you.
We'll make it. Talk to us.
Pretty bad, so.
Hey, what's your name? Tom Canavan.
Tom, what happened, man?
Big boom. Come down the steps, everything fine till we got to the basement, and then everything just fell in. I got trapped under there with another guy, crawled out, kept getting hit in the head, bags all around. Finally, we clawed our way out over the rubble.
Yeah.
Come on down. We did all right.
Well, it's the early hours of the morning in Washington, where reporter Deborah Knight now joins us live. Deborah, can you begin by telling us the mood in the American capital at the moment?
Well, it's been an intense roller coaster ride over the past, I've lost count of the hours already. It's really changed from immediate shock, the mood here, to a sense of dull, numb, stunned feeling. It's a feeling that I don't think I ever want to experience again, and it's one of those moments where you see the vision, the fresh vision that we keep seeing of the immediate terrorist attack, and the stomach just turns. It is a terrifying thing that has occurred. I drove past the Pentagon building a few hours ago, and it is horrific. There's a gaping hole in the side of what presumably was an impenetrable building. The world's largest office building is just, it's crippled. There's office supplies ready to teeter out of those floors which have collapsed on each other and fall on the rubble. And basically the fire is still blazing. The firefighters are there grappling to try and put it out. I saw about 5 or 6 ladders perched against the side of the building that's not going to collapse, pumping water in there, and that's obviously hampering rescue operations. Early reports from this building alone of 800 people possibly killed at the Pentagon.
Frightening. Deborah, are there any updates on just what is going to happen to the Prime Minister John Howard when he's likely to fly home?
Well, the Prime Minister is horrified about this event, like everyone watching it around the world. He's finding it difficult to comprehend, but he's feeling it more personally because he has been there, witnessing it firsthand. He saw the smoke coming from the Pentagon building shortly after the attack, and he was evacuated from the building. He flew to Washington for this US trip on a commercial flight. There's not a government jet here waiting to ferry him home. And even though the US commercial airspace is going to be reopened, expected to be reopened tomorrow about midday, there are no firm plans on what will happen to the Prime Minister and how he will get home. Could be a military flight from the United States or from Australia. He, his wife, his son Tim, they're all secure, they're all safe in the ambassador's residence here in Washington, but word is still being awaited on the fate of the many Australians who do live and are visiting the United States.
I'm sure we'll be talking with you again very soon. Thanks, Deborah. That was Deborah Knight reporting live from Washington.
A shocked but resolute US president has given an unequivocal response to his nation.
Good evening. Today, our fellow citizens, our way of life, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts. The victims were in airplanes or in their offices, secretaries, businessmen and women, military and federal workers, moms and dads, friends and neighbors. Thousands of lives were suddenly ended by evil, despicable acts of terror. The pictures of airplanes flying into buildings, fires burning, huge structures collapsing, have filled us with disbelief, terrible sadness, and a quiet, unyielding anger. These acts of mass murder were intended to frighten our nation into chaos and retreat. But they have failed. Our country is strong. A great people has been moved to defend a great nation. Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America.
As we heard, Prime Minister John Howard is tonight bunkered down with his wife and son in Washington, still deciding when and how they'll come home. Information on Australian casualties is difficult to confirm, but Mr. Howard is warning there will be Australian casualties.
After seeing what first appeared to be a horrible accident, the Prime Minister and his official party were struck with the shocking realisation that the United States was under terrorist attack.
Well, you can see these pictures. It's obviously something devastating has happened.
A press conference originally organised to discuss the refugee crisis back home in Australia captured everyone's overwhelming disbelief.
It appears to be a most horrific, awful event that will obviously entail a very big loss of life.
What was your reaction when you saw those pictures?
Oh, dreadful. Just appalling. Awful.
But without warning, as the briefing continued, Washington was hit. The Pentagon building, just kilometres from the Prime Minister's hotel and a site he'd just visited yesterday, was struck by a large passenger plane and several other explosions. John Howard left the briefing to the sight of dense smoke billowing from what was considered one of the most secure buildings in the world. Panic quickly erupted on the streets outside. The area surrounding the Pentagon descended into complete chaos.
Keep walking down, we got to clear the park.
The Prime Minister was quickly evacuated to the Australian Embassy 10 blocks away with his wife Jeanette, son Tim and complete official party. As helicopters swept the building, the US Secret Service stepped up security with semi-automatic weapons joining personal luggage inside. Digesting a situation impossible to comprehend, a visibly shaken John Howard read from a letter he sent to the US President.
Dear Mr. President, the Australian government and people share the sense of horror experienced by your nation at today's catastrophic events and the appalling loss of life. I feel the tragedy even more keenly being here in Washington at the moment. In the face of an attack of this magnitude, words are always inadequate in conveying sympathy and support. You can, however, be assured of Australia's resolute solidarity with the American people at this most tragic time. My personal thoughts and prayers are very much with those left bereaved by these despicable attacks upon the American people and the American nation.
The sheer disaster, initially thought to be even worse for Australia than first expected, with news that the hijacked plane that slammed into the Pentagon was an American Airlines flight due to connect with Qantas and then fly to Australia. At this stage, no Australians are thought to be among the 58 people on board the plane travelling from Washington to Los Angeles.
It is the question, though, of whether there were any Australians on some of those flights. We have to prepare ourselves for that possibility.
The only good news, 2 Australian defence workers originally unaccounted for at the Pentagon have now been found. As a numb calm descends here on the streets of Washington, the Prime Minister is now reassessing how and when he'll come home. Events planned for the final 2 days of this official visit are obviously now cancelled. The entourage now on standby to leave at any time. Moved from the Australian Embassy, the Prime Minister is now using the Ambassador's residence as a safe house. In Washington, Deborah Knight, 10 News.
America has gone on a war footing. Battleships are steaming back to harbours to enforce security. And a reminder, this special 10 News service will continue uninterrupted.
Also coming up, Australians tell of their horror caught up in the maelstrom of New York's terrorist attacks. A sea of red floods the world's stock exchanges as panic sweeps financial markets. And a security shield drops around airports and terrorist targets amid fears of further attacks.
A Brisbane man working inside the World Trade Center says it took him nearly an hour to escape. He's one of many Australians who witnessed the carnage firsthand.
Australian Adam Hopp was working on the 73rd floor when he heard a deafening roar followed by chilling screams.
I just assumed it was a bomb. When you feel something like that, you can't know that it's a bomb, a missile, a plane crashing into you.
Like hundreds of his colleagues, the landscape architect fled to a stairwell.
It took us approximately 50 minutes to get down. And that's just, walking down the stairs and stopping for congestion because people are coming out from other floors.
Many of those people were seriously wounded. The 37-year-old says a strange calm then took hold. But once outside, he realised the magnitude of the devastation.
I hope I live. It's coming down on me.
It was carnage. It was a Steven Spielberg war movie around the base of the building. Everything was smoking. There was blood and body parts.
Victoria Police Assistant Commissioner Noel Perry fled his Manhattan hotel and watched both towers crumble from the Brooklyn Bridge.
People around me crying and screaming a little bit. Some people get a bit anxious, but Fortunately, common sense prevailed, and a lot of us just yelled out, stay calm. They just walk.
Like thousands of visitors, Mr Perry is now stranded in New York, missing the safety and comfort of Australia like never before.
I intended to go back or to go to the United Airlines office within the World Trade Center this morning at 8:30, but fortunately we slept in. Otherwise I might have been there myself.
Martine Griffiths, 10 News.
America's blackest day has caused a wave of selling on stock exchanges across the world amid fears the terrorist attacks could bring forward a global recession. Shares plunged on all markets. Here in Australia, the All Ordinaries was down more than 4%. Worst hit, insurance and airline stocks.
Virtually the moment this strike at the heart of American capitalism occurred, global stock markets began reacting. The Australian stock market dropped 90 points in the first 15 minutes of trade. It hovered between 3 and 4% down throughout the day.
Worst hit stocks generally has been the banking sector. The insurance company's been lower, and some of the media stocks, such as news corporations, also come off substantially.
Gold and gold-related stocks fared better as safe havens in uncertain times. Energy stocks rose too, over concern oil prices will skyrocket. Wall Street shut down immediately and will remain closed tomorrow. It normally trades $50 billion a day. Stock markets from London to Europe and Asia all slumped between 5 and 9% on fears a global recession is now assured.
If business and consumer confidence continue to weaken and people do not spend, not invest, not employ, then we're going to see implications for the global economy.
While Australian companies are certain to be affected, the Treasurer was playing down the likely effects.
The US is a very, very large economy. It's something like 19 trillion Australian dollars. So let's keep things in perspective there.
Of all the Australian companies likely to be affected by this tragedy, one will be affected more than most. Shopping centre manager Westfield only recently secured a 99-year lease on the management of the retail areas within the World Trade Center. The deal cost the shopping centre giant $800 million. Its main concern now, though, for staff in the devastated buildings. One American employee remains unaccounted for. Westfield withdrew itself from early trading, but assured the market it is insured for terrorist attacks. And that may now point to the long-term impact for American insurance companies, especially when previous attacks, like the World Trade Center bombing in the early 90s, are considered.
The total insurance bill was $510 million. Now we're looking at both buildings being disappeared, and we're probably talking in the trillions.
But for the moment, financial markets, like everyone else, are simply gripped by a scale of devastation too large to comprehend. Eddie Meyer, 10 News.
Now a look in more detail at the figures from the Australian share market, which has sunk to a 14-month low. The All Ordinaries sliding 132 points. Nearly all shares finished the day lower. NAB shed $1.57, News Corp $1.60 and AMP lost $1.28. The Australian dollar is buying 51.88 US cents, over 35 pence, under 62 yen and 57 euro cents. Gold surged during the day, closing nearly $7 higher at 285 US dollars an ounce. And we're joined now by Michael Blythe at ComSec. Well, Michael, the global turmoil has spread to our markets today.
Yes, Jennifer. I mean, the sheer scale and unexpected nature of the devastation that we're seeing in the US at the moment has had a very big impact on our market today. It's seen investors scurrying towards the sidelines, seeking safe havens. Amongst the sea of Reading today, the only rises we saw were in the gold sector and some of the other resource companies. Any company with a big offshore exposure was pretty harshly treated today. We saw big falls in media stocks as News Corp was down, big falls in transport as Qantas shares moved lower, and big falls in the insurance sector, particularly in any company where it was seen as having exposure to the reinsurance risk happening in the US at the moment.
And Michael, do you agree with the pessimistic predictions for the world economy?
Look, we're moving into uncharted territory on that one. We do know that when economies are weak, they're vulnerable to shocks, and clearly we've already seen some of that fallout today with the disruption we're seeing to communications, to transport, to financial markets, not just in the US but elsewhere. We're likely to see some impact from lower business and consumer confidence. Higher oil prices, as we saw last year, can have a big impact on activity. These are all new risks in the global outlook. They're all on the downside.
And where to for the Australian dollar?
Well, these uncertain times, normally we see the flows into the US dollar. Of course, the flows have been in reverse this time round. Those safe haven flows have partly gone to the Australian dollar and the New Zealand dollar. Higher oil, gold and metal prices have also helped on that front.
Thank you, Michael. Michael Blythe, live from ComSec.
Well, America's Day of Horror began just like any other. The streets of New York bustling with business people and tourists. Here's how the catastrophic chain of events unfolded.
Tuesday morning, New York City. For the people of the Big Apple, a glorious start to the day. The grand twin towers of the World Trade Center piercing clear blue skies. Then, out of the blue, the unimaginable. It was 8:45 local time, 11:45 last night Eastern Time Australian, when a packed passenger plane slammed into the North Tower. Confusion and panic take hold, but no one was prepared for what was to happen next. 18 minutes later, 9:03 local time, a second plane is seen approaching the South Tower, the world watching in disbelief. America was under attack. Just as the magnitude of these terror attacks began to sink in, yet another hijacked plane was on a collision course. 9:40 a.m, the Pentagon, America's military hub, erupted into a fireball. Back in New York, people scrambled for their lives, disoriented, hysterical, unsure where to run. Survivors inside the Twin Towers tried to escape the infernos gutting the buildings. Most wouldn't make it. 9:50 a.m, the South Tower, the second attacked, crashes to the ground. Just 10 minutes later, 10 a.m. US time, another aircraft crashes, this time in Pennsylvania. No buildings are hit, the passenger jet slamming straight into the ground. There's no clear reason why. One theory, its pilot crashed his craft, unwilling to follow terrorist orders. Thousands dead, thousands injured, but still more were to lose their lives. Its partner obliterated, its foundations rocked, the North Tower collapses. It's 10:29, an hour and 45 minutes after that first attack. Shell-shocked but defiant, the US president vows to find those responsible.
The United States will hunt down and punish those responsible for these cowardly acts.
As night fell, that thick cloud of ash and dust that hung over New York all day was still visible, an eerie blanket glowing through the bright lights, rescue workers continuing their difficult, grim task. They call New York the city that never sleeps. Tonight, it was an entire nation.
And these are the fatal flight paths taken by the 4 planes involved in the attacks. The first plane, a Boeing 767, American Airlines Flight 11, left Boston at 7:45 a.m. local time, destination Los Angeles. Less than half an hour later, it slammed into the World Trade Center in New York. 92 people were on board. The second plane, United Airlines Flight 175, also a Boeing 767, left Boston at 7:58 a.m. local time, destination Los Angeles. An hour later, it crashed into the World Trade Center. 65 people were on board. The third plane was a Boeing 757, American Airlines Flight 77, left Washington at 8:10 a.m, destination Los Angeles. It dived into the Pentagon in Washington less than an hour later. 64 people were on board. And the fourth plane was another Boeing 757, United Airlines Flight 93, left Newark at 8:01 a.m, destination San Francisco. It crashed southeast of Pittsburgh 2 hours later, 45 people on board. In all, 226 people were killed.
Tonight, security forces are scrambling to ensure US consulates across Australia are protected. Federal police will keep a 24-hour watch on the buildings until further notice.
As the terror in America continued to unfold, federal police here in Australia acted swiftly, securing all US consulates throughout the night. Barriers were moved in to cordon off the embassy in Canberra. Security staff were on high alert as more details of the terrorist attacks filtered through. Protective Services officers also stepped up procedures in Sydney. The federal government says Australia cannot afford to take any risks at this time, despite no apparent threats. Similar scenes in Melbourne. Early this morning, a guard searched plant beds surrounding the 5-storey building. Consulate staff arriving for work were checked for identification and all personal items in their cars were scanned. Alison Ryan is a contract worker from Dallas. She says she desperately tried to call friends in New York this morning.
It has been really distressing. We were up most of the night just with calls from family and people, but we've gotten in touch with most people. I've had trouble getting contact with friends in New York just because of the phone lines, but I hope everyone's okay.
The Melbourne building also houses 7 other companies, but many workers were sent home as they received the devastating news.
I haven't spoken to anyone, just I met a co-worker. He was told basically it's closed for the day, so just head off.
Others arrived at the consulate to pay their respects.
Surreal, so unbelievable, and it takes a while before you start to realise that there's so many people. It's awful.
Friends of the Earth had planned a protest here at the US consulate for this morning. As a mark of respect, they've now called it off.
Friends of the Earth Australia and the Nuclear Free Australia as organisations are committed to peace and stability in the region. So the only appropriate action today is to pay our respect and condolence to the people of America.
The demonstrators oppose Australia's support for the US National Missile Defence Program. Meantime, the federal government says all US consulates will remain locked down indefinitely. Raquel Stevens, 10 News.
Well, now Raquel joins us live from the US consulate here in Melbourne. Raquel, what is the current situation there?
Well, Mal, not a lot has changed. The US consulate here on St Kilda Road remains closed, and it's unclear at this stage whether, in fact, it will reopen. As you can see behind me, the American flag, it's been flying at half-mast for most of the day. There's been a constant procession of people all day bringing flowers, writing notes and basically paying their respects. Police today said that the entire nation now was on counter-terrorist alert and that extra security procedures are now in place. They say at this stage there have been no threats, but still they don't want to take any chances.
It includes a number of security measures which we've undertaken. We have provided security and vested interest measures to look after a number of United States, Islamic and Israeli buildings and personnel.
And Mal, in addition to that, the Jewish schools and synagogues, as I believe, are also on high alert tonight. So a tense time ahead. I guess we just have to wait and see how the situation develops tonight.
Thank you, Raquel. Thanks a lot, Raquel. Raquel Stevens reporting live from Melbourne's US consulate, which has, as you've just seen, become a focus for local sympathy and mourning.
This special edition of 10 News is continuing without a break and now recapping some of the details. The death toll from the tragedy in the United States might not be known for weeks, but thousands are feared dead. Some of those killed could be Australians. Searchers continue to risk their lives combing through the ruins of buildings.
Also coming up, how Melbourne has reacted to the attack at the very heart of America. 5 Bulldog players in New York tell how fate played a hand in their survival in a holiday nightmare. And the amateur pictures that have shocked the world as jetliners become the latest weapons of international terrorism.
A wave of emotion has swept across the country, with Australians greeting the terrorist attacks with utter disbelief. Many are cautioning President George W. Bush to think carefully before he meets violence with violence.
The country woke to headlines too chilling to comprehend.
Well, it's like something out of some movie, wasn't it? I mean, it's like out of Armageddon. It's just that I think it's all a little bit unreal for everybody at the moment.
To be honest, I don't know how to react. I'm not even sure what's prompted this attack.
The orchestrated terrorist attacks brought America to its knees and Australia paused to take in every detail. Newspapers sold out minutes after hitting the streets, wave after wave of live pictures beamed to a shocked audience.
It was the most sickening assault against society. It's pretty dull. Everyone's not feeling very happy about today. You ask people how they're feeling, they're just, yeah, I'm all right, it's just feeling really down.
The reality all too stark for this woman whose family lives in New York.
My parents remember Pearl Harbor, and they're truly frightened. I can't describe how scared they sounded.
With the tragedy still unfolding, thoughts are now turning to revenge. But many Australians have urged President George W. Bush to think very carefully before he retaliates.
I shudder to think what the ramifications of this could be. George Bush seems to be pretty uptight about it all.
At St Paul's Cathedral, heads were bowed in memory of the dead, candles lit for those left to pick up the pieces.
One of the reasons that people are in shock is because if a thing like this can happen on such a scale, what is it actually saying is the next step? I mean, what are we looking at here? Are we looking at war on a massive scale?
The world is watching and waiting. Darren Lunny, 10 News.
There are also fears tonight for the safety of former US President Bill Clinton, who's visiting Port Douglas. Local police, emergency teams and the American Secret Service have been keeping Mr. Clinton under tight security.
As the world witnessed the worst terrorist attack in American history, in Port Douglas, attention was on the safety of the country's former President Bill Clinton. Holidaying in the region since Tuesday, he now remains under lock and key inside his presidential suite at the Sheraton Mirage Resort. His plans to relax since his whirlwind tour of Australia now turned upside down. Local police, including special emergency response officers and Mr. Clinton's own Secret Service staff, swarming on the area from midnight last night.
We're just taking the usual precautions for obviously a high-profile person as Mr. Clinton, with the events that have transpired overseas.
It's believed the former president was to depart the region for Hong Kong on a commercial airline this morning. Those plans cancelled and the president's movements put on hold. It's understood former President Bill Clinton could be evacuated from the north within the next 24 hours. But while there aren't any special aircraft booked to arrive in Cairns, officials say US military only need around 20 minutes clearance before arriving to collect him. A former FBI special agent who's just arrived in Cairns is like the rest of America, unable to believe terrorists were able to get through the system undetected.
These people were so accomplished and planned this out so well that sometimes all the checks in the world aren't going to stop them if they want to accomplish what they're trying to do.
Danae Jones, 10 News.
Security for next month's Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Brisbane is now under review. There are demands for CHOGM to be scrapped, but both state and federal governments insist it will go ahead.
Surrounded by tight security, this is how the leaders of 49 countries will travel from Brisbane Airport to the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. The big question now, is it enough, and will CHOGM still go ahead next month?
I'm making it clear that Queensland is still prepared to host CHOGM because we are not going to be stood over by thugs and murderers.
The US crisis has prompted an emergency security summit of police, government and the CHOGM task force.
The matter of security in terms of Australia has not been altered.
No firm decision yet on beefing up CHOGM security. Instead, an assurance the option is there and always has been. Until now, militant student protesters were thought to be the biggest risk. On the streets of Brisbane, many are demanding CHOGM's cancellation.
I don't know that Brisbane's ready for the type of security problems we're likely to have. A bit scary.
Although no specific threat to Australia has been identified, the country is on high alert. Terrorism expert Dr Daryl Jarvis is urging a rethink on CHOGM, especially if British PM Tony Blair attends.
A postponement until this situation has been dealt with and dealt with effectively would probably be the more judicious path to follow.
Any decision to delay or cancel CHOGM rests ultimately with the Prime Minister. He's still in the United States. His Deputy John Anderson and the Attorney General stress at this stage the Commonwealth heads will meet in Brisbane.
I'm not aware of any uncertainty about CHOGM. The plans for CHOGM are continuing. The security arrangements for CHOGM have been being put in place for quite some time, and under the National Anti-Terrorist Plan, the arrangements for CHOGM have been and will continue to be tested.
If you let the terrorists win, then democracy loses.
Still unclear as whether the Queen's visit to Australia will go ahead. Authorities are speaking to Buckingham Palace about the Queen's plans to open the Commonwealth meeting. Darren Roberts, 10 News.
And as a close American ally, it's feared this country could also be a target. Australia has activated its counter-terrorism plan, key federal buildings and defence installations on heightened alert. Increased security is being provided for American, Israeli and Jewish properties.
2 a.m. and the first signs of the counter-terrorism plan being swung into action. The American embassy in Canberra is evacuated and an exclusion zone is thrown around it and the nearby Israeli embassy.
The level of alert over
United States and Israeli assets and installations in Australia has been raised to the highest level that applies in a situation where there is no actual attack.
3 American naval vessels in Darwin Harbour yesterday slipped anchor before daybreak. At the Pine Gap joint facility near Alice Springs, nothing's left to chance. The realisation is somebody somewhere has declared war on the United States.
I was very pleased to hear the President say that this was an attack on freedom and freedom would be defended.
Soldiers in battle gear and face camouflage provided extra security at the RAF base in Canberra. The VIP squadron busy ferrying ministers to and from crisis meetings. Foreign Minister Alexander Downer says world politics will never be the same. An historic and frightening development has shaken any complacency.
That you can't be too cautious. Who would have thought 24 hours ago that the worst act of terrorism in history was going to be perpetrated on the United States?
Security was stepped up at Parliament House, Canberra, and other key federal buildings around the country.
We are not a target like the US is a target, but the lesson these days of international terrorism is that decent, open, democratic societies like ours are enormously vulnerable.
500 Commonwealth parliamentary delegates meeting in Canberra paused for a moment's silence in memory of the dead and issued a statement condemning the attacks as an atrocity against humanity. The bipartisan support for America extends beyond expressions of sympathy. Australia has promised to assist Washington in whatever military retaliation it may take against the perpetrators. In a statement, the US ambassador has expressed his nation's gratitude.
We have indicated that we will obviously play our role as an international citizen. We will assist in any way that we can.
Members of the Counter-Terrorism Committee monitored developments throughout the day. Paul Bongiorno, 10 News.
And our political editor, Paul Bongiorno, joins us live from Canberra now. Paul, how long are we likely to be on this heightened state of alert?
Well, Mel, that's not clear, but before I go into that, I can give you some information that we've just received from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. They say they can't account for 50 Australians missing in New York. They're not sure whether these people are in fact victims or injured, but that's the latest count from the phone-ins and the checks that they've been making during the day.
Paul, just if I may interrupt on that one, do we know who these Australians are? Are they workers, tourists, or...?
That I don't know. I suspect they're probably workers and tourists, Australians that their relatives or friends have let the department know that they are in New York or were in that area.
That is disturbing. As you were going on to say?
Well, I was just going on to say that I have checked with the Acting Prime Minister's office in regard to the counter-terrorism alert and plan that is now in place. It's open-ended and is being constantly reviewed.
Is it too early to see how all this is going to play out politically in light of the forthcoming election?
Well, it probably is, but it has to be said that crises, and certainly crises of this dimension, tend to play into the hands of incumbent governments. And in a sad sort of way, what's happened in New York and with the suspicions of who may or may not be responsible for it has dovetailed into some of the issues being raised by the Tampa boat people crisis.
All right, thank you, Paul. We'll leave you there for now. Our political editor, Paul Bongiorno, live from Canberra.
And the agonising wait continues for Australians whose relatives or friends might have been caught up in the United States tragedy. The Department of Foreign Affairs in Canberra has established a crisis hotline. Already 15,000 callers desperate for news of loved ones have registered. Missions in the US are liaising with local authorities and airlines to establish just how many Australians are involved.
There are a number of Australians working in the World Trade Centre and it's possible that some Australians could have been on some of those aircraft.
The crisis hotline numbers to call are 1800 00 22 14 and 1300 555 135.
The rest of the world has been watching helplessly as America's apocalypse is played out on television. But as we wait for the United States to take the next step, here in Australia there have been other stories impacting on our lives today.
Yes, Mal, Ansett has been dealt a massive blow. The stricken airline facing liquidation after Qantas ruled out a takeover. Angry workers have locked down several Ansett sites around the country, refusing to release aircraft after the federal government rejected a taxpayer-funded bailout.
Confusion and disillusionment for Ansett workers, leaving with their belongings from Melbourne's head office within an hour of Qantas ruling out a rescue package.
We love our jobs, we serve the public with a passion, and Air New Zealand have come and ripped us all apart, and now they're just chewing us up and throwing us out.
We don't really know what's happening yet, so... Qantas issued a press statement this afternoon declaring Ansett's problems are far too great for Qantas to take on. Thousands of casual staff have been sacked this afternoon, other stunned workers walking off the job. Reports are now surfacing of flight attendants refusing to board aircraft amid speculation this week's wages won't be paid. With Ansett losing more than $1 million a day, its owner Air New Zealand has called on the Howard government to underwrite the crippled airline to keep it flying.
We've just been advised that the Australian government does not favour this proposal, and we're now discussing with them a further option which has become available during the day.
If it is going to die, that is a corpse that will lie at the feet of John Howard and John Anderson's policy ineptitude.
Air New Zealand says it's now talking to other potential buyers, among them the Ansett Pilots Association, mounting a staff bid to take over the company.
We're a fine airline, we're a fine quality airline.
Public rallies supporting Ansett staff will be held this Friday. Stephanie Taylor, 10 News.
Also in other news tonight, the federal government has begun its challenge to a judge's order to bring the Tampa asylum seekers back to Australia. The boat people aboard HMAS Manura continue their journey to Nauru, despite yesterday's federal court ruling that they had been illegally detained.
What do people think we've got a defence force for if we've got the Australian courts telling us that we're not allowed to use them to defend the country?
After a brief procedural hearing today, the appeal has been listed for tomorrow. The court has imposed a deadline of late Friday to return the asylum seekers.
Fire has destroyed a fruit processing plant in northwestern Victoria, leaving a damage bill of up to $15 million. Several houses were evacuated as a toxic cloud spread towards the tiny town.
The giant fruit and vegetable processing plant at Weeman, 30 kilometres southwest of Robinvale, was well alight when firefighters arrived. Police believe the blaze started in the machine shed. Fuelled by cardboard packaging material, the fire quickly spread through the huge factory, destroying expensive equipment and a B-double truck. At one stage, firefighters were concerned about toxic smoke.
Due to the nature of the toxic fumes, a number of houses in the Weeman area have been evacuated in the direction of the smoke.
The factory's owner, prominent Melbourne grocer Rocky Lamartina, rushed back from interstate when he heard of the blaze.
He's going to be quite devastated when he sees the state of the place, I think he realises how bad it actually is.
There were no injuries in the blaze. Arson squad detectives are sifting through the debris and treating the fire as suspicious. Tim Stoney, 10 News.
But today's news has been dominated by the terrorist blitz on America. It even cast a shadow on what was to have been a triumphant return home of US champion tennis player Lleyton Hewitt. He was on one of the last flights out of New York and says he has mixed feelings about returning to the United States.
Just 2 days ago, Lleyton Hewitt was the king of the American sporting world. The 20-year-old's US Open win, the biggest news in the States. But the unthinkable terrorist attack has ensured his victory has been quickly forgotten in America. Lleyton returned to Adelaide this morning with his parents and girlfriend Kim Clijsters. He was met with tight security before facing the media.
You know, as soon as I heard, you leave you got a sick feeling in your stomach. It sort of throws everything into perspective, a little bit more. I think it's great that I won a few tennis matches and that, but there's a lot more larger than tennis matches, that's for sure. When you look at the bigger picture and life in general.
Hewitt flew out of New York just hours before the first of the hijacked aircraft hit the World Trade Center.
To think that I was at New York airport going to Los Angeles, like a few of those flights were only probably 5 or 6 hours before those people.
He admits to being worried about flying in the US when he returns early next year.
There's going to be that added fear, I suppose, now a little bit. It sort of does hit home because we are travelling week in and week out. If this happened halfway through the US Open week, there could have been a lot of athletes, a lot of tennis professionals travelling on those flights going to LA, and it could have been them that got hijacked.
Lleyton Hewitt now has Davis Cup commitments here in Australia. He's glad to be back on home soil.
It's a place where I can put my feet up and relax.
Mark Adenall, 10 News.
Fate has played a hand in the survival of 5 Western Bulldogs players who were sightseeing in New York. Their families had a long, anxious wait until they were told the group was safe after changing their mind about visiting the World Trade Center.
It was the end-of-season trip Bulldog mates had been looking forward to. But for Luke Darcy, Simon Garlick and Craig Ellis, they ended up witnesses to disaster. They fatefully changed their minds about a planned visit to the World Trade Center, deciding to take in other nearby sites in New York.
Well, by the time we got down to about 10 blocks away, the first tower had collapsed. So, yeah, it was just a really scary thing to see, being that close to where it was. And also, you know, at that stage, you know, people were actually jumping out of about the 80th and 90th floors of the second tower.
While their teammates were just 200 metres from the towers, Tony Liberatore and Nathan Brown watched the drama unfold on television in their hotel.
I can assure you, you know, just to let all the Bulldog people know, and my mum and dad and my wife and my kids, that we're all A-OK. We're all staying at Luke's brother's house, Matt.
As soon as the magnitude of the tragedy was clear, the footballers rang family members. Janet Darcy was desperate for news when Luke called from a public phone on a New York street.
Knowing the boys, if there was the tallest building in New York, that's where they were going to be headed. So as it turned out, they were very close, just a couple of 100 metres away at one point, and I think they're a bit shell-shocked and